Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating challenge. It's something facing so many organizations, communities, even us as individuals today. How do you bridge that significant, sometimes kind of overwhelming gap between deeply rooted traditions and, well, our rapidly shifting contemporary culture?
Yeah, that's a big one.
We're going to explore how some groups are really breaking the code to not just connect, but actually thrive in this fast-changing world.
Right.
So our mission today really is to unpack this concept of contextualization.
Okay.
You think of it like maybe updating the software for a timeless operating system. It's all about how core principles, whether ancient wisdom or, a new business strategy, can be presented and experienced in ways that feel relevant.
Understandable.
Yeah, understandable, deeply engaging, but, and this is key, without compromising their core integrity.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a pretty rich set of sources. They offer insights from missiologists. These are essentially experts in cross-cultural communication and also church leaders, plus some really insightful real-world observations.
Okay.
Now, while a lot of the examples come from a faith context, the strategies, the mindsets they reveal for adapting and connecting, they're pretty universally applicable, I think, especially in modern Western societies.
Right, so lessons for everyone.
Definitely. You're going to find some, well, truly surprising facts maybe, and some really practical ideas for fostering genuine connection in any group you might be part of.
All right, let's dive in then. So our sources jump right in, highlighting what they call a yawning cultural chasm.
Yawning. That paints a picture.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's this growing disconnect where many traditional forms of engagement or community just feel.
Yeah.
Well, the words they use are incomprehensible, irrelevant, or archaic to people outside those established circles.
Yeah, that resonates. You hear that a lot.
And it's not just a feeling, apparently. There's a British missiologist, Stuart Murray Williams. He points out that these traditional forms often only really appeal to certain subcultures. Specifically, he says, white, middle-class, educated, and middle-aged conformists.
Oof. Quite specific.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. Many people who step away, they aren't actually losing their core beliefs.
Right. That's a key distinction.
Exactly. But they find the traditional structures themselves uninspiring, disempowering, crushing, and dehumanizing. Whoa!
Strong words.
Very. In what the sources call post-Christendom, this societal shift where, traditional religious institutions don't have that automatic cultural sway or loyalty anymore.
Right. That default position is gone.
Gone. This disconnect is leading to what they term a hemorrhage of disillusioned individuals.
Right.
It's like employees leaving a company, not because they hate the mission, but the corporate culture just feels stifling.
That's a good analogy. And to put maybe a finer point on this, there's a striking statistic from our sources. The Christian Index, it's a newsletter from Georgia Baptists.
Yeah.
They report that nearly 70%, 70, of Georgia's 8.3 million residents remain unchurched.
Wow. Despite,
reported growth in baptisms and membership within those traditional structures. It really points to, as they say, a false sense of security if you're only looking at those old metrics.
70% is just staggering. It really highlights that chasm.
It does. It's a symptom of this bigger trend of institutional disengagement.
So, okay, what does this actually mean for how organizations or communities engage people today?
Well, the sources reveal that in these communities that are successfully breaking the con, the average person often finds their connection through a really simple thing, a personal invitation.
From a friend.
From a friend, a coworker. And here's the kicker, as you said earlier.
Uh-huh.
This friend might be newly connected themselves. They might still be exploring their own journey.
So it's not always the long-term veterans bringing people in.
Exactly. It's a powerful lesson in how grassroots, authentic relationships are kind of becoming the new front door.
That's fascinating. So the journey itself shifts then.
It really does. What's interesting is that formerly disconnected people, they often attend for several years, maybe participate in lots of aspects of community life before they publicly express any kind of formal commitment.
Years, really?
Years, yeah. The sources tell us that conversion or commitment in this context becomes an integrated part of the discipleship process. It's a step along a much longer path of growth and integration.
Okay, that makes sense.
And those who follow this longer, more gradual path, interestingly, they seldom fall out. They seem to be more deeply rooted.
Huh. That's really counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
You'd think a quick commitment would be well, quicker,
Mm.
but maybe less sticky.
Mm.
Why do you think that longer path leads to more lasting commitment?
I think it comes down to authentic ownership.
Okay.
When people have the space to explore, to question, to genuinely integrate something into their lives, their eventual commitment comes from a place of really deep personal conviction and lived experience.
Not just ticking a box.
Exactly. Not just intellectual agreement or some, quick decision made under pressure. It's like someone who test drives a car for months, researches it, talks to people.
Builds a relationship before buying.
Right. Versus an impulse purchase. That deeper engagement usually translates to greater loyalty, greater staying power.
That makes a lot of sense. So this raises a pretty crucial question then. How do we present these core principles or build community in a culturally relevant way without watering down the truth?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. The sources challenge us here. They say we need to take biblically informed risks. They use this analogy of Peter stepping out of the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Peter was not a failure because he looked down and began to sink. If anyone failed, it was the 11 who stayed in the boat, waiting to see if it could be done.
Wow. That's quite a challenge.
It really is. It's a call for any leader, any organization really, to be bold enough to step into those maybe uncharted waters if that's where the real connection needs to happen.
Yeah. And to address this, the sources introduce two key concepts. The first one is indigenization.
Indigenisation, okay.
The idea here is that an effective community or organization should really spring forth out of the soil in which it is planted.
Like it belongs there naturally.
Exactly. Its leadership, its expressions, its forms, its functions. They should genuinely reflect the local context, but at the same time, it should also be serving as a transforming agent within that culture.
Okay, so reflecting it, but also influencing it.
Precisely. Think of like a thriving local business whose leadership and products just get the community's needs and character.
Right. And what's striking about this, for me, is how it challenges that common mistake.
Yeah.
Doing the big nationwide search for the most talented leaders.
Bringing in the outside expert.
Right, or importing some model that works somewhere else entirely. Our sources observe that if the leadership doesn't emerge from or naturally fit the local context,
Yeah.
the impact is often short-lived or limited, no matter how much raw talent they have.
Talent isn't enough.
Apparently not. Truly indigenous groups, they often find their leaders, their collaborators, their resources right within their own community. That resonates, doesn't it? Thinking about community organizing or grassroots movements.
Absolutely. And this connects directly to that other key term we mentioned earlier, contextualization.
Right.
This is basically the understanding that eternal, universal truth, or, any core message, is always understood and appropriated by people through their own unique cultural grid or framework.
How they see the world.
Exactly, their lens. Now, it's really vital to note, while culture shapes understanding, the truth itself, the core message, should never be compromised.
Okay, that's crucial.
But traditions that were once maybe helpful cultural adaptations, think of a long-standing company policy or a specific way a community event has always been run, the way we've always done it.
Those things can, over time, actually become barriers.
Yep.
And they might need to be removed or at least re-examined for deeper connection and engagement to happen. Okay, so traditions aren't sacred just because they're old. They need to serve the purpose.
That's the idea.
Let's turn then to what the sources call the most controversial point.
Yeah.
How the message is actually communicated.
Yeah, this one stirs things up sometimes.
I bet. And it's not just about the format like should we use video or text. It's critically about the starting point.
The starting point. Okay. So for those already, let's say, steeped in a particular worldview or even specific industry jargon, right? The starting point is often direct revelation. Thus saith the word of God. Or maybe, here are the established facts.
Yeah.
You move from the principle to the application.
Assumes shared ground.
Totally. But for others, especially those new to or disconnected from that worldview, their starting point is radically different. It's more like, does this have anything to do with my life?
Yeah. Is it relevant?
Is it relevant? Exactly. Some are even, as the sources say, ignorant or maybe even hostile towards existing texts. Like that person who, when handed religious texts, genuinely asked, how many books do you Christians use?
Wow. That anecdote just says so much, doesn't it? It highlights that huge difference in initial assumptions.
It really does.
Paul, the figure from the sources, gives a classic example of adapting the starting point.
Okay.
When he was speaking to a Jewish audience in Pisidian Antioch, he began with a summary of their shared history. the Old Testament, a common reference point.
Right, meet them where they are.
But then, to a very different Greek audience in Athens, he started completely differently. He acknowledged their religiosity, even pointed out an altar to an unknown god.
Found a point of connection.
Exactly. He connected with them at their point of relevance, their existing curiosity, before presenting his core message. It's kind of a masterclass in audience analysis, really.
It really is. And in both cases, Paul presented his core message. That didn't change.
Right.
The key is understanding where the communication begins. The underlying principles stay constant, but if there's no point of connection, no relatable starting point, the message just risks becoming, as the sources put it, simply meaningless facts rather than life-changing truth.
Like trying to teach advanced calculus to someone who hasn't grasped basic algebra. Just noise.
Doesn't land.
That makes perfect sense. And this brings us to a really powerful communication technique the sources talk about. Redemptive analogies.
Ah, yes, this is fascinating stuff.
Sounds it. It involves finding these cultural bridges, like existing stories, customs, symbols within a culture that can carry a new message. It's translating abstract ideas into familiar, resonant forms.
Yeah. Don Richardson provides an incredible example from his work with the Sawi tribe.
Okay.
Get this. Their culture actually honored treachery. So in their minds, Judas, he'd be the hero of the biblical story.
Whoa, okay, that's a communication challenge.
Huge. Yet they also had this peacemaking ritual. It involved a father sacrificing his own child, a peace child, to end conflict between warring parties.
Wow, intense.
Incredibly. But this allowed Richardson to present his message by highlighting Jesus as the greatest peace child given by the greatest father.
Using their own cultural framework.
Exactly. He found the analogy within their culture. Another example mentioned is the Yali tribe's places of refuge, which offered safety from revenge killings. These analogies, they aren't just clever tricks. They serve as a cultural compass to point men and women toward Jesus, connecting their deepest cultural understandings to a new truth.
That's an incredible story. It really shows the depth of understanding you need to make those connections. The sources also share a personal anecdote from one author, which I loved.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about giving his wife a diamond ring for their 25th anniversary. Pretty relatable, right?
Mm-hmm.
He then compares this relatable, but let's face it, ultimately impractical act of profound love.
Right. Diamonds aren't strictly necessary.
Exactly. He compares it to Mary pouring that incredibly expensive perfume on Jesus' feet in the Bible. He used this story to illustrate the kind of impractical yet utterly profound nature of love, like the love expressed by the cross.
Ah, finding the modern parallel.
Yeah. Redemptive analogies, as they're called, are described as like 21st century parables, using common language, common symbols, just like Jesus used stories about lost coins or sheep or sons.
To convey deep truths in a way people could grasp.
Exactly, finding the universal in the specific.
And this whole concept is reinforced by Dan Kimball in his book, The Emerging Church. He highlights a really significant shift in culture. Experience is the new currency.
Experience is the new currency. What does that look like in practice?
Well, it kind of flips the traditional learning model, right? In the past, maybe you gain knowledge first from a lecture, a book, and then later you might validate it through experience.
Like reading the manual before using the new gadget.
Exactly. But Kimball argues, and I think we see this everywhere, today the order is often reversed. People have an experience that is later validated by knowledge.
Yeah. So try it first, figure it out later. Like jumping into a new app or game?
Precisely. Think about how much we learn hands-on now, tutorials, product demos, often before we ever crack open the manual, if we ever do.
Yeah, that shift has huge implications for how we learn, how we communicate, how we interact. Everything, really.
Massive implications. And our sources outline some key differences in communication approaches based on this shift.
Okay.
So in what they call a modern approach, let's say a sermon in a church, or maybe a keynote presentation, that might be the absolute focal point.
The main event.
Right. The preacher or speaker is seen as a dispenser of biblical truths or expert knowledge there to solve problems. The emphasis is on the explanation of truth.
Primarily words.
Primarily words, yeah. And learning from scripture or the core content happens mainly during that specific event or gathering.
Okay, so that's the modern model. What about the emerging one?
In contrast, an emerging approach sees that sermon or presentation as just one part of a broader, more immersive experience.
Part of a whole.
Yeah. The teacher helps people apply ancient wisdom or core principles to actual kingdom living or daily practice. The emphasis shifts to both explanation and the experience of who truth is or what the principle feels like in action.
So not just hearing it, but living it, experiencing it.
Exactly. Communication becomes this richer tapestry: words, visuals, art, silence, testimony, story. And the central teaching time, it motivates learning that happens throughout the week.
Not just on Sunday morning or during the conference session.
Right. And a lot of that learning even happens outside the traditional building or meeting room in the context of community, relationships, real life. It's a completely different pedagogy, really.
So it's not about saying one approach is inherently better than the other.
No, not at all.
It's more about recognizing that many cultures exist in North America and beyond, right?
Yeah.
And truly reaching them requires a communication style that's maybe more missional than pastoral.
That's a good way to put it. More outward-focused and adaptive, perhaps, and less purely focused on maintaining the existing structures for those already inside.
Yeah, less inward-looking.
Exactly. And this applies directly to how communities practice things together. Our sources argue pretty strongly that community expressions, whether that's a team meeting, a cultural festival, a worship gathering, they must genuinely take on an expression that reflects the culture of the worshiper or participant if it is to be authentic and make an impact.
Reflect the culture of the participant. That's key.
It is. And it points out that many of the worship wars, for example, or we could call them style clashes in other types of organizations.
Yeah, the arguments about music or format.
Right. Those are often based on traditions and personal preferences, not necessarily on deeper principles or the actual mission.
That rings true. The discussion in the sources traces some different historical approaches, doesn't it? How groups tried to balance reaching out versus keeping current members happy.
Yeah, it's this perennial tension. They talk about the seeker-targeted approach, big in the 80s and 90s.
Right, where services were sometimes even totally separate for newcomers versus committed members.
Exactly. Then there was believer-targeted, which kind of assumed everyone there was already on board and positively predisposed.
Which might not be welcoming for someone new.
Potentially not. And then seeker-sensitive, which tried to acknowledge the tension between those two poles. The aim was to focus on believers, but remain, quote, seeker-comprehensible.
It sounds like a delicate dance, trying to keep everyone happy.
It is, and the sources illustrate that tension really starkly, they say. The degree to which a worship service is seeker-targeted is in direct proportion to the degree to which it is believer-hostile.
Ouch.
And the reverse is also true. The degree to which a worship service is believer-targeted is in direct proportion to the degree to which it is seeker-hostile.
So, optimizing for one group inherently creates friction for the other. That's a tough design challenge for any community gathering.
It really is.
And this is where these code-breaking communities seem to shine, right? They recognize this tension.
Yeah, they don't ignore it. They actively aim to create environments where everyone, long-term members, newcomers, people just checking things out, can experience profound connection and transformation together.
How do they do that?
They ask really critical questions about their gatherings. Questions like, is the setting actually inviting and familiar to someone walking in for the first time?
Not intimidating or weird.
Right. Is the music or the general atmosphere recognizable and accessible? Or is it full of inside references? Can people relate to the communication style, or is it packed with jargon?
Good questions.
Is the message grasped experientially, not just intellectually? Is the language understandable? And this is crucial. Is it safe for people who are still in process, still figuring things out?
Still challenging them.
Exactly. While still creating enough tension to cause people to move forward in their faith or commitment. It's a really nuanced balance.
Wow. That's a powerful shift in how we think about designing community connection. And it brings us right to another core challenge. How does all this apply to, well, evangelism? Bringing new people into a movement or a way of thinking.
Yeah, another area where the starting point is key.
Because the sources argue it's often fundamentally different now, right?
Yeah.
It's not always just about getting agreement on a simple proposition.
No. Often it's about leading people to actually change their worldview.
Which they compare to convincing someone the world is round after they've always believed it's flat.
Exactly. That's a heavy lift, as you said earlier.
It really is.
And this means that engaging new people, or evangelism, needs to be less programmatic and more process-oriented.
Okay, less of a fixed program.
And maybe less propositional and more relational. It's about building bridges of relationship, not just handing out intellectual blueprints.
Right. The author's church provides a really striking example of this in action, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. They're apparently among the top 100 out of like 43,000 churches in their denomination in terms of baptisms, a traditional metric of outreach success.
Okay, so they're effective by traditional standards.
Right. Yet they explicitly state they have resisted any formal types of evangelism training.
Wow. No programs.
Seems like it. They feel they've landed in a new world where the focus has shifted. People aren't necessarily starting their journey near the cross or even facing the cross, as they put it.
So they're meeting people much earlier in the process or maybe on a different path entirely.
Exactly. It's a powerful, kind of counterintuitive success story, focusing on relationships and process over formal programs.
So what does this new approach look like if it's not programs?
It really centers on this idea of a journey.
Okay.
It assumes things like, well, trusting that a higher power or maybe just innate human curiosity is already at work in people's lives before you even meet them.
Interesting. So you're not starting from zero.
Right. It involves building authentic relationships, genuinely caring about people, actively listening to understand where growth or questioning is already happening in their lives.
Connecting the dots.
Helping people connect the dots between their story and Jesus's story or, the organization's core mission or story. And maybe most importantly, becoming a living epistle.
A living letter. What does that mean?
It means letting your actions, your life, speak volumes about what you believe. Your life becomes the demonstration, not just your words.
That underscores that evangelism or outreach isn't some standalone event then.
Not at all. It's one part of a larger process that involves the entire disciple-making process, or the entire process of integrating someone into the community's way of life.
And conversion, or that moment of formal commitment, is truly part of that larger journey.
Exactly. Part of discipleship, part of integration.
Okay, and what's really fascinating here is an observation the sources make about timing.
Ah, yes, the timing thing. Individuals who take longer to publicly express their faith or commitment, they're actually less likely to fall through the cracks.
Less likely to disappear later.
Right. Conversely, those who commit very quickly often disappear just as quickly.
So slow and steady wins the race, maybe.
It speaks to the robustness of a slower, more integrated, more relational onboarding process, doesn't it?
It really does. And this mirrors an observation from a missionary, right? Someone returning from Malaysia.
Yeah, exactly. This missionary observed that in Malaysia, conversion or formal church membership typically happened after individuals were already pretty firmly grounded in scripture, often engaged in community, and usually involved in some kind of service.
Wow. So they were basically already living like members before they formally became members.
Pretty much. It suggests that discipleship or integration began long before the formal conversion moment.
And the argument is that North America, or modern Western society generally, is now effectively a mission field where these same realities increasingly apply.
That's the core argument. Whether it's a church, a nonprofit, a social movement, the dynamics of connecting with people who don't share your starting assumptions are becoming much more similar to cross-cultural missions.
Okay. So what are the core principles of this code-breaking approach to integrating new people? Discipleship, you might call it.
Well, the sources lay out a few key things. First, beginning prior to formal commitment. This often involves years of participation.
Years again. Wow.
Yeah, years of being part of a local community before any kind of public declaration. Second, participation in community prior to commitment. Relationships are the real currency for moving people forward. Small groups, affinity networks, they're designed to be inviting, low-barrier entry points.
Makes sense. Relationships first.
Third, participation and experience prior to commitment. Creating strategic experiences like workshops, volunteer days, open forums, and celebrating even small steps of progress. Gatherings are designed to let people experience things and progress at their own pace.
Learning by doing, experiencing.
Fourth, participation in service prior to commitment. People on their journey are affirmed, given opportunities to contribute, to serve. That act of serving actually moves them forward.
Or empowers them.
Exactly. And fifth, even participation in shared causes or missions prior to commitment. The sources share this great story of a woman, still on her journey, uncertain about faith stuff, but she decides to go to South Africa to do humanitarian aid work with her community group. Why? Because, she said, God is working in my life.
Wow. So her involvement in the group's mission actually came before her settled belief.
Precisely. The action, the shared purpose, drew her deeper into the journey.
That's powerful. Now, it's important to clarify something here, isn't it? A common misunderstanding.
Yes, definitely. These emerging approaches, they don't downplay formal commitment or conversion. That's a big misconception.
So they're not saying commitment doesn't matter.
Not at all. In fact, the sources suggest there's often a stronger emphasis on and celebration of public commitments, precisely because they represent the culmination of this deeper, longer, more intentional process. It means more.
Right. It's earned in a way.
Exactly. And then ongoing growth discipleship after commitment is described as more organic, but just as intentional.
Organic but intentional. How does that work?
Often involves things like small groups, one-on-one mentoring, pushing people outside their comfort zones through service, but avoiding this passive feed me more meat mentality where people just sit and consume information.
So it's about continuous active engagement, not just endless teaching.
Spot on. Active participation in growth.
Okay. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, the message seems really clear. Whether you're talking about a faith context, a nonprofit, a business, any area of human connection, really, the power lies in contextualizing, making those deep truths or core values or complex ideas, making them relevant and accessible in the here and now.
Yeah, building bridges.
Building bridges.
Yeah.
And building an indigenous approach, one that truly springs from its local environment, authentically reflecting its people, while also helping to transform that environment for the better.
Absolutely. Our sources conclude that once you really commit to break the code, to embrace these principles of understanding, adaptation, genuine connection, the opportunities for really impactful connection and understanding are, well, pretty much endless.
Endless opportunities. That's quite a hopeful note to end on. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. What's one specific traditional barrier in your own life or your community? Maybe it's a dated communication style, an old process that doesn't work anymore, an uninviting meeting format. What's something you now see could perhaps be reimagined or even removed to foster a more authentic and impactful connection? Think about those cultural bridges and those crucial starting points we discussed today.
Great question to ponder.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.